You know the T-34. You know the T-90, the tank that beat Hitler, and the tank Russia is fighting with in Ukraine right now, and here's the part that should stop you. The T-90 is not a new tank. It is 50 years old. Underneath the fresh paint and the new name, it is a T-72, a tank designed in 1973. Russia is fighting the biggest war in Europe since Hitler with a tank older than the men driving it, and it is no accident. For 50 years, the largest tank power on Earth has refused to build a new tank. They keep rebuilding the old one and selling it as new, so why? And there is a second thing, even harder to explain. When these tanks get hit in Ukraine, they do something no Western tank does. The whole turret blows off and flies into the sky, only the Russian ones. So how did the most built tanks in history become the ones the whole world now laughs at? Both questions have the exact same answer, and it goes all the way back to the T-34. We are going through every Soviet tank in order, from the T-34 that stopped Hitler to the T-90 burning in Ukraine right now. And one of them is the most produced tank in the history of the world, a Soviet tank that almost nobody outside Russia can even name. It all starts with one man, and a tank that killed him before it ever fired a shot. His name was Mikhail Koshkin, and in the winter of 1940, to prove his new machine could survive anything, he drove two prototypes more than 1,000 kilometers through the snow, from the factory to Moscow and back. He caught pneumonia somewhere in that frozen run, and within months it killed him. He never saw what he started. What he started was the T-34, and in June of 1941, the finest army on Earth drove straight into it and stopped cold. German gunners hit the T-34 dead center and watched their shells skip off into the sky. There are letters home from German crews describing firing 20 and 30 rounds into a single one, and watching every shot spark off the sloped front and fly away into the trees. The trick was almost insulting in how simple it was. Instead of standing the armor straight up, the T-34 leaned it back at a hard angle, so shells glanced off like stones off a windshield, and the slanted plate behaved as if it were twice as thick as it really was. It floated over mud and snow on wide tracks, while the heavier German tanks sank and froze. It ran a diesel that was slow to burn and a 76mm gun that could gut anything Germany owned. The Germans coined a word for the feeling: tank fright. For the first time in the war, it was the German crews who were scared, and the T-34 was not even the worst of it. Beside it rolled one of those tanks named for a politician, the KV-1, sitting in a road and holding up an entire German division for most of a day before it was finally killed. One of Germany's best generals, Heinz Guderian, admitted in writing that his men had met a tank they did not know how to stop. For a few months in 1941, the country everyone had written off as backward had the best tanks in the world, and it almost did not matter at all. The first week of the invasion, near the towns of Brody and Dubno, the Soviets actually threw more tanks at the Germans than the Germans even had. Hundreds of them T-34s and KV-1s. The German guns could barely scratch, and the Soviets lost anyway. Thousands of tanks gone in a few days. Because the crews were half-trained, the radios did not work, and nobody could coordinate the attack. The lesson the Soviets took from that catastrophe was not to build better crews, it was to build more tanks. Because the steel was never the point. The point was a rule the Soviets had just discovered, and it is colder than anything the Germans ever wrote down. The Germans built their tanks like fine watches, hand-fitted by master craftsmen, beautiful and slow. The Soviets built the T-34 to be ugly on purpose. The welds were rough enough to see across a room. Most of them had no radio at all. There was no comfort inside, no thoughts spared for the crew, because the crew was not the thing being counted. The thing being counted was the tanks, and you could stamp a T-34 out by the tens of thousands in factories that had been ripped out of the ground and shipped past the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombs, where teenagers and women built them on double shifts in halls that sometimes had no roof. The rule that came out of those factories was brutal and simple. The tank is a number. The crew is a number. Build them faster than the enemy can kill them, and you win. The early T-34 proved it in the cruelest way, with a cramped two-man turret that forced the commander to aim and fire the gun himself, which left the one man who was supposed to be watching the battle staring blind down a gun sight instead. Soviet crews died by the thousand. The Soviets did not flinch, because a dead T-34 could be replaced by morning, and that was the only figure that mattered. At Kursk, the largest tank battle ever fought, they did not win by being better. They won by being more. At a single field called Prokhorovka, hundreds of tanks crashed together at point-blank range in one afternoon of smoke and burning steel, and when it cleared, the ground was carpeted with wrecks, most of them Soviet. The Soviets called it a victory anyway because they could replace their losses, and the Germans could not. They fed T-34s into the German guns and kept feeding until there were no German guns left. You can build the perfect tank. But if I can build 10 rough ones in the time it takes you to build one, I do not need to beat you. I just need to bury you. America built its best tank, the Sherman, about 50,000 times over, and people still call that a flood. The Soviets built more than that of the T-34 alone. More than 80,000 T-34s buried the German army, and the tank was not even finished fighting. 5 years later, in 1950, North Korean crews drove the upgraded T-34-85 across the border into the south, and for a few brutal weeks, the American army had almost nothing that could stop them. It took heavier tanks and total control of the sky to turn that cheap old machine back. The rule had just won the largest war in human history, then walked straight into the next one. Now watch it conquer the peace. The war ends in 1945, and for one moment, the Soviets are tempted to break their own rule. At the victory parade in Berlin, they roll out a brand new heavy tank, the IS-3, named for Stalin, a low, brutal slab with a nose shaped like an arrowhead, and the Western officers in the stands go pale. But the Soviets had already learned where monsters lead. Before the war, they had built a true land battleship called the T-35, a 50-ton giant with 5 separate turrets bristling in every direction. And they had loved it so much March, they paraded it across Red Square as the very symbol of Soviet power. When Germany invaded, almost every T-35 broke down and was abandoned by its own crew within weeks, most of them without firing a single shot. The monster was a fantasy, so the Soviets put their shiny new heavy tanks down and bet everything on one cheap, simple tank built in staggering numbers. The most, not the best. And that bet produced the tank I told you to hold on to, the most produced tank that has ever existed. There's a forgotten stepping stone first, the T-44, which slid the engine sideways and lowered the whole machine, quietly fixing the T-34's worst habits. Almost nobody remembers it, but it leads straight to the T-54, and it's near twin the T-55, and around 100,000 of them were built, more than the T-34, more than any tank in any country ever. And here's the part that matters most. The T-55 was not built mainly to fight the West. It was built to be handed out. After the war, the Soviet Union was not just defending Russia anymore. It was exporting a revolution into Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the gift it pressed into the hands of every new client state and friendly strongman and red flag waving movement was almost always the same, a T-55. If the AK-47 was the rifle of the Soviet cause, the T-55 was its tank. It crushed the uprising in Hungary in 1956 and rolled into Prague in 1968 to do it again. In the Six-Day War, Israel destroyed or captured hundreds of Arab T-55s in under a week. It fought in Vietnam, and the Soviets drove their own into the mountains of Afghanistan, where the cheap tanks bled for 10 years and changed nothing. India and Pakistan dueled with them. China copied it as the Type 59, and it was a column of those copies that ground into Tiananmen Square in 1989. More than 50 countries ended up driving the T-55. For 40 years, the tank on the news in almost any war on Earth was a T-55, or something pretending to be one. But the rule always charges a price, and the crew always pays it. To keep the T-55 low and small and cheap, the Soviets crushed the inside down until a tall man could barely fit, and the turret sat so low the gun could hardly tilt downward, which means a Soviet tank cannot hide behind a ridge and peek over the crest the way a Western tank can. To shoot, it has to show almost its whole body. The men sat jammed together, half blind, almost on top of the ammunition. For now, against other armies driving the same cheap tanks, none of it shows, and that bill sits unpaid for 30 years. There was one more tank before the big change, the T-62. It looked like a T-55, but it carried something the world had never seen. A smoothbore gun, a barrel with no rifling grooves inside it at all, built to fire a new kind of high-speed dart. It was the first smoothbore gun ever put on a tank, an idea so far ahead of its time that the West later copied it. But when the T-62 fought in the deserts of the Middle East in 1973, against crews who could see farther and shoot straighter, it got beaten badly, and that war came with a second warning. Almost nobody paid attention to. For the first time, regular foot soldiers with cheap guided missiles were killing modern tanks by the hundreds. Infantry dug into the sand with rockets. They carried on their backs, wiped out whole columns of Israeli tanks in the first days of the war. A few men in a ditch could now destroy a machine worth a fortune. 50 years later, that is exactly what would happen to Russia and Ukraine. Now we reach the decision that turns a Soviet tank into a bomb. By the 1960s, the guns are getting bigger and the shells longer and heavier, and a human loader can only heave so many into the breech before his arms give out. The West solved this by building roomier tanks and keeping a fourth man, whose only job was to load. The Soviets refused to pay for the extra room, so they did something no one else dared. They fired the loader and replaced him with a machine that feeds the gun by itself. On paper, it is genius, because one less man means a smaller turret, and a smaller turret means a smaller, cheaper, harder to hit tank. But it raises one ugly question. If the loader is gone, where do all his shells and explosive charges go? The West sealed them in an armored box behind a thick blast door with thin panels in the roof, so that when the ammunition is hit, the blast tears up and out through those panels, away from the men, and the crew can climb out of a tank that is already dead. The Soviets did the exact opposite. They laid the shells flat in a ring on the floor, all the way around the crew. The men did not sit behind the ammunition. They sat inside it. That is the rule cast in steel. The crew parked in a circle of gunpowder, because protecting them was never worth the wait. They built two versions, and this is the rivalry hiding inside the numbers. The T-64 was the clever one, packed with new technology and a strange flat engine that overheated and broke, so fragile and expensive that whole units spent more time repairing it than driving it. And the Soviets kept it home and barely let a foreigner near it. The T-72 was the rule's true heir, the cheaper, cruder, tougher machine with the bigger number, and 25,000 of them were built, flooding the world exactly like the T-55 before it. Iraq and Iran threw them at each other for 8 straight years. Syria sent them against Israel. And if a country wanted a modern tank in the 1980s and could not build its own, it bought a T-72. But every single one carried that ring of fire on the cabin floor. So here's what happens when one is hit. A shell or a missile punches through the armor and lights the ring of ammunition, and in a Western tank the blast doors hold, and the fire roars up and out through the roof. But in a Soviet tank there are no blast doors, because the men are sitting in the ammunition. The blast has nowhere to go, so it blows out through the weakest part of the tank, the ring the turret sits on, and rips the entire turret off the hull and throws it dozens of feet into the air. The 3 men inside almost never get out. That is the secret the lineup was hiding all along. It is not bad luck, and it is not one bad tank. It happens the same way every time, because it was the price of cheap, and the Soviets paid it gladly with other men's lives. So, a real question, and I want your honest answer. Would you climb into a tank that is cheaper and harder to hit, but seats you inside the ammunition, or a heavier, pricier one built first to carry you back out alive? The Soviets answered cheap. Every single time for 50 years. Drop your answer below, because crews are living and dying on that exact question. question right now. For a long time, the rule looked unbeatable because the scale was almost unimaginable. Through the 70s and 80s, the Soviet fleet swelled into the largest land army that has ever existed. The T-64s, the T-72s, and that fast new tank with a gas turbine engine like a jet. The T-80, which as you now know was already the second tank to carry that number. It was brutally quick and it drank fuel like a jet too, even standing still, and it cost so much the Soviet Union could barely afford the ones it built. And just to prove the rule one more time, this was the era when Soviet engineers drew up the strangest tank ever imagined, a thing called Object 279, a nuclear-age experiment shaped like a flying saucer, riding on 4 sets of tracks, built so the shockwave of an atom bomb would wash over it without flipping it. Exactly one was made, because the leadership had decided the future was missiles, not monsters, and it rolled straight into a museum, the most beautiful dead end the Soviets ever drew. Every time they reached for the spectacular, the rule dragged them back to cheap. By the mid-80s, the Soviets and their allies could field something like 50,000 tanks, more armor than the entire rest of the world combined. And every May, they paraded it across Red Square, column after column in perfect lines, a river of steel with no end. The West was genuinely terrified that if the Cold War ever caught fire, this flood would reach the English Channel in days. But under the parade sat a secret nobody wanted to say out loud. This monstrous army had not fought a serious enemy in 40 years. Its whole reputation rested on 1945 and on parades, and a parade is not a war. Nobody actually knew whether the rule still worked, or whether the whole thing was the largest bluff ever assembled. In 1991, the bluff got called. Iraq had one of the biggest tank armies on Earth, around 5,000 machines, and the best of them were Soviet T-72s. When the American-led coalition came to drive Iraq out of Kuwait, the world braced for a slaughter, and it got one, it just pointed the other way. The ground war did not last weeks. It lasted 100 hours at a patch of empty desert called 73 Easting. A small group of American vehicles blundered into an entire Iraqi brigade inside a sandstorm, so thick they could barely see. And in 23 minutes, they destroyed dozens of tanks and lost not one of their own. A day later at Medina Ridge, it happened again on a larger scale. American tanks firing from beyond 3 kilometers while the Iraqi guns could not even reach back. The American tanks had thermal sights that stared straight through the dust and found a T-72 kilometers away. The T-72s never saw the shot that killed them. And the American guns spat darts of depleted uranium so heavy and so fast they went in one side of a Soviet tank and out the other. And as those T-72s died, their turrets leapt into the air, the exact same way they would leap 30 years later in Ukraine. Now, in fairness, these were export tanks, stripped-down models with thinner armor and worse sights than Russia kept for itself, crewed by poorly trained men with no air cover. And the defenders of the design will tell you, correctly, that it was not a fair fight. But the world does not watch fine print. It watched turrets fly and it never forgot. After those 4 days in the desert, the Soviet tank was a punchline. The timing was merciless, because that same year, 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed and ceased to exist. The empire and its steel symbol dying in the same 12 months. The tanks burning in a foreign desert, while the country that built them quietly vanished from the map. If you think only the cheap export tanks died like that, Russia proved otherwise at home with its very best. In the winter of 1995, Russian columns drove into the rebel city of Grozny on New Year's Eve. Hatches shut into streets full of fighters who knew exactly where the armor was thin. Small teams with rockets let the tanks roll deep, then hit them from the cellars and the rooftops at once, above and below the steel. And the Maikop Brigade drove into the center of the city and was effectively destroyed in a single night. Hundreds of men gone before the sun came up. Turrets came off in the streets of a city, in front of teenage conscripts, and the design still did not change. Russia took Grozny in the end by simply pounding it into gravel, but the rule had stopped being a strategy and become a body count. And Russia could not afford to notice, because Russia could not afford anything. The collapse had left the country broke. The grand plan for a brilliant new generation tank ran clean out of money. So Russia did the one thing it has always known how to do. It reached for the cheap answer. It took the old T-72, a design from 1973, and it dressed it up with new optics, a new turret, bricks of reactive armor bolted to the outside to swat missiles away, and a new fire control system so it could finally fight at night. Then it stamped a fresh, modern name on a half-century-old tank, the T-90. On the surface, a new machine, proof that Russian armor was back. Underneath, a T-72 in a nicer coat. The same hull, the same crushed compartment, the same ring of ammunition around the crew. The rule from 1940 still sitting there, still loaded, but it was cheap and it worked well enough and it sold. India alone bought more than 1,000. Algeria bought them too, and by the time the war in Ukraine arrived, the T-90 was the proud face of the Russian army, the tank on the recruiting posters. So here is your second question. You take a 50-year-old tank, bolt on new armor and a new name, and sell the world a comeback. Is that brilliant thrift, or a fresh coat of paint over an old coffin? Answer below, because in 2022, the question stopped being rhetorical. Russia drove its tanks into Ukraine. The T-72s and the T-80s and the T-90s, the same family, the same low turret, the same autoloader, the same ring of fire on the floor, into a war the engineers of the 1960s never dreamed of. The fields were full of soldiers carrying missiles that cost a few $1,000s and weigh less than a child. The American Javelin climbs high and drops straight down onto the thin roof of a tank, right onto the ammunition, and the British NLAW does the same. A few $1,000s killing a machine worth millions. Russia even sent its newest and best, the T-90M, the one it had advertised for years as the future, and the T-90M's tires burned in the same mud as the 50-year-old T-72s, their turrets landing in the same ditches, and over all of it hung cheap plastic drones, watching every road, dropping grenades through open hatches, calling down artillery on anything that moved, a drone costing a few $100s finding a tank, and the 3 men inside it and ending them from 2 miles away. Never heard, never seen. So for the first time in history, the whole world watched the rule pay its bill, in clear video, thousands of times, turrets in wheat fields, turrets upside down on the highway, turrets thrown onto the roofs of apartment blocks. Because of the drones and the phones, almost every wreck was photographed and counted, one by one, until the tally climbed past 3,000 tanks, more than most countries on Earth have ever owned. In the first 2 years alone, Russia lost more tanks than Britain, France, and Germany have in their whole armies combined. It was the Red Square parade run backward, the endless river of steel replaced by an endless line of burned-out hulls, filmed from a ditch. Which brings us finally to the tank that was supposed to break the rule. After 80 years of feeding crews into the fire, Russia actually built the cure, and it is called the T-14 Armata. On paper, it fixes everything. The turret has no men in it at all. The crew sits low in the nose of the hull, sealed inside an armored capsule with every shell locked away behind steel, so that if the ammunition is hit, the men are supposed to walk out, the first Soviet design in 80 years that protects the people inside it, instead of spending them. Russia rolled the T-14 across Red Square in 2015 as the future of Russian armor, and during a rehearsal for that very parade, one of them stalled dead in the middle of the square and had to be towed away, on camera, in front of the world. That was the warning, and it told the truth. The T-14 was too expensive and too complex for Russia to actually build in numbers. It leaned on advanced parts Russia could barely make, and once the war brought heavy sanctions, those parts dried up. Fewer than 2 dozen were ever finished, and they are too precious to lose, so they sit far behind the lines, hiding from the very war they were built for. The cure exists, Russia simply cannot afford to protect its own soldiers. So it keeps shipping the cheap ones, the T-72s and the T-90s, ring of fire and all. The one tank built to save its crews sits in a museum, while the death traps go to the front. So look at the whole 80-year line one more time, from the T-34 to the T-90, and the con falls apart in your hands. The clean march of progress was never real. The Soviets never tried to build the best tank in the world. They built the most, one cheap idea and one cold rule, rebuilt and renamed and resold for 80 years, the same machine making the same bargain the whole way down. That bargain won the largest war in history, armed half the planet, and it is the reason the most produced tanks ever made are Soviet, and the reason you still could not name the most produced one of all, the 100,000 T-55s. And it worked for 50 years because nothing could kill those tanks fast enough to make the rule a problem. Then the weapons got cheap. A tank takes years and a fortune to build, and the missile that kills it now costs less than a used car and takes a minute to fire. And when the thing hunting your tank is cheaper than the tank, building more stops being a strategy, and just becomes a longer line of wrecks and a longer field. So the turret thrown into the sky was never a glitch, and it was never bad luck. It was the bill come due at last for 80 years of building tanks, as if the men inside them did not count. The numbers were always a lie, the price was always the men, and Russia is still paying it today. Same tank, same rule, same dead crews. If you want the other side of this story, the German tanks that drove into the T-34 in 1941 and recoiled in horror. We walk the complete history of Germany's armor, from the Panzer I to the King Tiger, and it is on screen right now. Like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.